A little bit. I'm Dr. Joe Milanovich, and I'm a professor at Loyola University, Chicago. I'm a wildlife biologist. I'm a herpetologist. That means I study reptiles and amphibians, and I have been for quite some time studying these animals. So, I can answer any questions about these guys and about wildlife in general. And I just wanted to talk about my path a little bit. I had a different path to get to where I am being a scientist. I grew up in the Detroit area, and it was a pretty urbanized area that I grew up in. I was a low income student. I wasn't exposed to wildlife at all growing up, really, for the most part. And that's pretty uncharacteristic of a lot of wildlife biologists. Most of us grew up in nature or catching animals, and I just didn't do that at all. I just didn't have the opportunity to do that. I was also a first generation college student, so it was something that I wasn't really aspiring to do until I got into high school, really looking to college. And once I got into college, I went to a small school called Adrian College in Michigan, and there's only four science faculty there, but one of those science faculty was a herpetologist. So I kind of fell in love with the field then, and I really fell in love with the idea of becoming a college professor then as well. And that was able to give me enough of a carrot dangling, I think, to start really looking into becoming a faculty member and doing science more. But up until that point, up until I really started college, it wasn't something I even thought about doing at all. So the point is, everyone has their own different path in life, and my path was different than a lot of other my colleagues, but it was what was right for me, and it's really gratifying to be in the position to help you guys out today, learn about amphibians. So what I'm going to talk about is a couple things. What I want to do first is just give you a general kind of introduction to amphibians and how cool they are and what kind of attributes they have. And what I'll talk about a lot today is why amphibians are in trouble. We see that global change is really causing a lot of issues for amphibians. So we'll talk a lot about what sort of issues amphibians have and what they're faced with, what kind of threats to their populations and distributions we have. And then we'll talk about why it's important to really think about amphibians and try to conserve them throughout their lifetime and throughout our lifetime. So what I'll do is just kind of dive into the presentation, and you all literally feel free to pop questions up, even if it's not related to what I'm talking about. And I can answer any questions that you have along the way, and we can, have them coming in on a rolling basis. Let's talk about amphibians first. You may not know this, but there's thousands of species of amphibians globally. And when you think about what makes up an amphibian, there's really three main types. We break them up into frogs and toads, and that's most of the amphibians on Earth. Here in Illinois, we have dozens of species of frogs and toads, but if you go to somewhere like the tropics in the Amazon, where I'm going in a few weeks, there's hundreds of species of frogs and toads, if not thousands. And every time there's trips to new areas that are more remote or less developed, like the tropics, then we find more species of amphibians, especially frogs and toads. So when we look at amphibians, most of them are frogs and toads. They make up about 88%. And then there's another group that is second highest, which are the newts and the salamanders. So if you think about those kind of long, slender guys like this tiger salamander here, and they are broken up into a couple different categories. There's newts and salamanders that have a pretty typical life cycle of amphibian where they need some water for part of their life. And there's other salamanders that don't need water at all in terms of their life cycle. Then the third group are these really interesting groups of caecilians. They're kind of this salamander type organism, but they don't have any limbs, and they live mostly in the tropics, and they live mostly underground. So there's these three types of amphibians. They're really diverse. These numbers are all wrong because we're finding new species basically every week. New species of amphibians get described, even though they've been on Earth for hundreds of millions of years. And we just had to picture that for a second here. We have these organisms that I'm telling you are threatened, and they have been threatened for quite some time now on Earth. But They have dealt with a lot. Their lineages of the amphibians that exist today have been unearthed for hundreds of millions of years. What happened to the dinosaurs happened to amphibians, and they got through it. So they're really hardy animals, which makes it more concerning that they're in decline today, and that they're scientists are worried about them. If you want to learn more about amphibians, there's a really great website. It's called amphibiaweb.org. This is a map from there. It's from 2017, so it's probably a little bit different, but not so much. What it does, this map in particular, it shows you the diversity of amphibians in an area. So the areas that are more red or dark in color have really high diversity of amphibian species, and areas that are lighter in color have less so. So if we look, we could see a really strong gradient of amphibian diversity. A lot of the diversity is around that equatorial line in the tropics, right? About 20 or so degrees north or south latitude of the tropics, we get tons of amphibian species. And if you look in particular, we see a lot of them congregating in the Amazon, and a lot of them in Madagascar, in Southeast Asia. If you look at North America, in particular, where we are in Illinois, there's about maybe 10 to 14 species or so of amphibians that exist in Illinois. A little bit more if you go to the Southeast US. And in Canada, it looks like there's none in Europe and in Russia, but there are amphibians there. There are definitely amphibians that exist all the way up to the Arctic Circle. You can find wood frogs in Alaska and Canada up to the Arctic Circle, but there's just not a lot of species there at all. My favorite, and this might be a question that you ask, my favorite by far is called the patch-nosed salamander. This is the first picture ever taken that we know of the patch-nosed salamander. This species was found by a colleague of mine, Dr. Bill Peterman. Me and Bill and a couple other folks were traveling around in the state of Georgia. That's where I did my graduate degree, is University of Georgia. And we are searching for salamanders, really kind of anything we can find. And Bill came up with this little female here, and we she's quite small, as you can see. She could fit on a dime, but she was reproductive. She had eggs in her belly. So right away, Bill and I knew that something was off and something was different. And as we explored it with our scientific team, Bill and I are graduate students at the time, and just searching the side of the road of Georgia, and we find this thing. So we built a team together, and we found out it was actually a new genus of salamander. And if you think about the taxonomy of animals, a new genus, a new species are found quite frequently. A new genus of salamander was a pretty big deal, especially since it was found in North America, where most of the species of amphibians have already been described. And since it was a new genus and a new species of salamander, it was a pretty big deal for us. They're pretty unique animals. This is a female here, and you can see that she has this white or this yellow patch on her nose. The males have a yellow patch as well, but they have dark stripes running down their back. They call that sexual dimorphism. Males and females look different. They're all pretty small. This is an adult, and the larvae are babies in the water. So they'll breed eggs, or they'll lay eggs in the water. The eggs will hatch in the water, and they're super tiny. I mean, a couple millimeters, the size of a pencil tip tiny when they're babies. So it's one of the smallest salamanders in the world, and I still to this day can't believe Bill found it, but I'm glad he did. My favorite by far. It only lives in a couple mile area in Georgia. It's a really in South Carolina is a really small area where it lives, but it's a super cool, unique salamander species. Okay, keep the questions rolling in. If you have any, I'm ready to answer them, and just go ahead and enter them in Q&A or chat. So let me tell you about why amphibians are so cool. There's a couple different reasons for this. The ones I like to start off talking about is their diversity. We talked about how many there are, thousands of species that exist, and that makes them really a unique set of animals on Earth when you have that much biological diversity, which is great. But What also makes them really unique is that they're incredibly abundant. And I mean, there's tons of these animals. So generally, where you find amphibians, even if it's just one species up in the Arctic Circle, there's generally a lot of them. And it's just kind of their life cycle of how they operate. When you're a small animal, and all amphibians are uh, predators in some part of their life. So they might start off eating plants, but most, if not all, amphibians, when they're adults, will eat insects. So you're really small, you're an insectivore, so you eat insects a lot, and coupled with that, we'll talk about your ectothermic, you're cold-blooded. So you have a really low energy requirement. That means there can be a lot of these things around. And when I mean a lot, there can mean a lot. So this is a really cool study that me and Bill did, my colleague Bill Peterman. And what we did was we looked at this little tiny salamander here. This is called the slimy salamander. That's the common name for it. It's a really cool species. They live all across the eastern US and especially the southeast US. And they're really unique in the sense that they are incredibly abundant. They're only about the size of your finger. So think about that. Just about the size of your finger. They're pretty small animals, but they live exclusively in forest and they really like kind of wet forest as well because these animals are actually lungless. They're vertebrate. They have a vertebrae just like we do, but they have no lungs. They breathe entirely through their skin. So that further enhances their ability to eat even less. If you don't have to create your own body heat, and all you need to do is create these kind of micro environments or find them where you can stay moist. They breathe through their skin with the oxygen exchange through the water, and they have a really kind of slow lifestyle. They don't move a lot. Their home range where they live is just a few meters squared. So when Bill and I looked at this, what we did was this kind of two parts. Bill looked at how many of these salamanders existed. And when he looked at his abundance of these, we were actually able to compare how abundant they were in terms of biomass. If you took all the salamanders in this forest in Missouri that we looked at and you weighed them, you said, this is how many amphibians exist in terms of biomass. And then you compared it to other animals. What we saw is that even though these things are the size of your finger, if you added up how much they outweigh all the birds, they weigh more than all the small mammals, and they even weighed more than all the deer in the forest. Tiny little salamanders. But there's so many of them that collectively they actually outweighed the biomass of all these other vertebrates, which is pretty cool. We have a few questions I'll address here. The first one is, what's the rarest salamander you've come across? That's an easy one. That's really easy for me. That's the patch-nose salamander. The patch-nose salamander is that species that Bill and I and our team described, and it's really quite rare because it has really limited distribution where it lives. It's about 3 or 4 square kilometers in this one part of Georgia and South Carolina where it lives, and that's all we've been able to find. When Bill and I started studying it, we found it at one stream. We looked pretty hard for about a year or two. We found, I think, another 7 or 8 streams. And then scientists started using what's called eDNA, environmental DNA. They're able to take water samples, and just from the water samples, they were able to detect new sites of the patch-nose salamander. Even with all those techniques, this animal is only known from less than 20 locations in the entire United States, and all those locations fit within just a couple square miles. Really rare. Okay. Another question here is a good one. Do I keep track of the amphibians that I've studied? Absolutely. I keep track as much as I can. So oftentimes what scientists do is they have sets of questions in different levels. Some questions scientists take an entire career to answer. Other questions can be answered in just a few years. And we kind of go in stages with respect to what we study and how much we study. But all the species that I study, I try to keep up to date, at least on the literature and what we're finding and learning about them. because that's how new questions come up. We have another question here. Since herpetologists work with amphibians and reptiles, have I done work with reptiles as well? Absolutely have. So right now I'm working with snakes in Indiana, the state of Indiana, where we're searching for a couple rare snakes using these really cool methods of camera traps. And I've studied box turtles in the past. I've studied Blanding's turtles, which are an endangered species in America and in the U.S. I've studied spotted turtles. When I was an undergraduate student, I did a lot of work in national parks studying reptiles as well. So I would call myself a general herpetologist, and you can even expand it to kind of wildlife biologist, but most of what I studied are reptiles and amphibians, all different kinds. Let me tell you more about how amphibians are super cool. We also know that they're cool because they have different, what we call life histories. They have different life cycles in a lot of ways. We see salamanders can be terrestrial fully, like that salamander that I talked about, the slimy salamander. It's fully terrestrial. It doesn't go near water at all. The only water it needs is from the moisture in the air where it can exchange oxygen. So it loves when it rains, right? It picks up the oxygen from the water there. And what that type of group of salamanders do, and there's some frogs that can do this as well, is they'll lay eggs on land completely. And in this case, these lungless salamanders will actually take care of their eggs. They'll actually brood their eggs, will wrap around them. They will protect them from predators. That can mean other salamanders. They can protect them from bacteria and fungi. And then these little babies hatch out of the eggs and they just start walking around and they're ready to go. Most amphibians, though, are what we call biphasic. What that means is they have a life cycle that requires water and land. In this case, we can think of just a really pretty typical frog. Most frogs will do this. And in fact, a lot of salamander species do this as well, where they're adults in land. They will lay eggs either in water or near water. Those eggs then will hatch and develop in the water. Let's say in this frog's case as a tadpole. You might call them polywogs. They're these little tiny baby frogs that are living in the water and they have gills just like a fish does. And then what they will do is complete what we call metamorphosis. Once this frog completes metamorphosis, they turn into this either froglet or a metamorphic frog, and then they grow as juveniles into adults and become reproductive and start the cycle again. It was pretty darn neat. So this is really a really common way for most amphibians to complete their life cycles, have this biphasic life cycle. Sometimes, though, it can be a little bit different. There's some salamanders here in Illinois and in the Midwest that do this, where they will actually be terrestrial as adults. And this blue spotted salamander here will do this. They're fully terrestrial as adults. They will live underground most of their life as an adult, 300 days plus a year. They're underground. Then they'll go to wetlands and they'll lay these egg masses here. The egg masses, again, they'll hatch and they'll turn into these larval salamanders that have gills, kind of like a tadpole, and they will root around and eat insects. And they can do one or two things then. Sometimes they will complete metamorphosis and turn into a terrestrial adult salamander. Other times, they complete what's called paedomorphosis, which means they become reproductive but still have these larval characteristics. So they look like a really big larval salamander, but they can actually produce egg masses as well. This group of salamanders, too, can actually do some really unique things where they don't need a male and female salamander to breed. They can actually clone themselves, so to speak, which is pretty darn cool for an animal. And then, of course, we see these animals that I talked about. This is a slimy salamander where they can actually breed terrestrially. These guys really never have to go into water. In fact, they really don't like water. They can actually drown in water. So this is a picture I took in a mine shaft that I completed my master's work with. And this is pretty cool because this picture is one of them that led to our work being highlighted in Sir David Attenborough's Cold Life in Cold Blood series. It's a series by the BBC that highlighted some of this work that we did. So you can see if you look real close, these little egg clusters here, they look like little grapes, and you can see little salamanders in there. And then the white in here are the egg yolks. So it's just like any other egg, they're feeding the nutrients to their babies, and this is a female protecting her eggs that she laid. So amphibians are really cool because they have these different life cycles. In addition to that, all these amphibians that I'm talking about are what we call poikilothermic. You may have heard the term described as cold-blooded. Really, the blood isn't cold. It just means that they are taking their environmental temperatures and they're using behavior and different physiological techniques to, basically stay warm under those conditions. So they're not creating their own body heat. They're using the environmental temperatures to regulate their own body temperature, and that's called poikilothermy. So that's pretty unique in the animal world. There's fish and insects do it, and to have a vertebrate that is really diverse in terms of where they live and how they live to be poikilothermic is really cool. A couple other questions here. So one of the questions from Emily is, have you ever done any work internationally? I have. I've done work in Canada most recently, and in a few weeks I'm going to Peru to do some research as well. Another question, if amphibians were to go extinct, what would happen to our ecosystem? That's a great question. And that's one that we're actually going to answer towards the end of this presentation. There's several different factors that influence what amphibians do. So we'll talk about those coming up. So I'll hold off answering your question now, but we're going to go into pretty good detail about what we think we might lose if amphibians go extinct. Okay. Another reason animals are cool, these amphibians, but also reason why they're oftentimes really at risk, is that they have really permeable skin. So amphibians, most of these, this wood frog here, will breathe through their lungs. They actually have lungs, most of them. But in addition to that, most amphibians can actually breathe through their skin as well. So their skin is really porous, and that is good for them in the sense that it gives them a lot of opportunities to breathe and exchange oxygen. But it's also bad because they got a bunch of holes in their skin. So if there's anything in the environment that's toxic or that is not favorable, then there's nothing really blocking it from entering their bodies. So having permeable skin is something that I think makes amphibians really cool, but also makes them really at risk for toxins and other things to impact their populations a lot. Okay. Another question here. Do I have any favorite zoology documentaries? I do. The Life in Cold Blood series by Sir David Attenborough is absolutely my favorite. It's not just because I'm in it, but it's because it's really, really well done. It shows you all these really amazing things about amphibians and reptiles across the world, doing all these really unique behaviors and evolving in different ways, and influencing ecosystems in different ways as well. So it's by far my favorite zoology documentary. In fact, all the life series are really, really unique. There's some on birds and mammals and other ones, and they're really real well done and really pretty interesting as well. Okay. We have another question here that I'll answer before we move on. The question is, how, if at all, does the composition of terrestrial salamander eggs differ from aquatic salamander eggs? Are they firmer? And they note that they always thought eggs have hard shell to protect them, and they don't have cushion from the water. That's a good question. So there's a couple things there. When we look at amphibians, they actually have an egg that is called a non-amniotic egg. So they don't have a shell around their egg. Their eggs are oftentimes jelly-like. So when we look at amphibians and we look at salamanders in particular, there's this group of terrestrial salamanders and then the group of aquatic ones, and their egg masses differ pretty significantly. If you think about a terrestrial salamander, most of them will actually lay eggs and they'll wrap around them and take care of them. So if you're doing that, then it's hard to have hundreds of eggs, especially since you're only about as big as a finger. So what we see, the big difference is the terrestrial salamanders will lay eggs oftentimes under rocks or logs, and there's a little cluster of grapes, and there might be 10 or 20 of them total. And they'll wrap around them, take care of them. But then if you look at the aquatic salamanders, they're really just kind of entering water bodies, a wetland or a pond, and they're laying eggs and leaving. So they're not really taking care of their eggs. So in that sense, if they're not providing any sort of what we call parental care, then their young might die at a faster rate. So they got to have a ton of them. So those aquatic salamander eggs are usually in bigger masses, lumped together, and there's hundreds and hundreds of eggs in there usually. And if you think about frog eggs, that's pretty similar to a lot of frogs that would lay eggs in wetlands and leave them. They'll lay a lot of them because they think that a lot of those young might die. So they differ in terms of number, and then also in like the physical shape of them is really different as well. There's some more questions here. So if amphibians were to go extinct, what would happen to our ecosystem? That's a great question. And towards the end of the presentation, we'll get into that pretty deeply. So I'll hold off on that. Here's another question. Are amphibians territorial? And if so, how do they show where their territory is? That's a good question. They are absolutely territorial, and they show that in a couple different ways. So a lot of times when you hear a frog calling, that frog is calling for a mate to kind of show that they're around to see if they can get a mate. But oftentimes they're calling just to say, dude, I'm here, back off. Like this is my territory. So when we look at frogs in general, a lot of times they'll use vocalization to say, I'm here, this is my territory, stay away. Other types of things that they do is maybe behavioral changes. So there are some frogs that um, probably most frogs will do this when they see each other. They can actually have some behavioral cues. They might bob their head. There's been frogs in the tropics that actually wave to each other to try to say, "This is my territory. I'm here," and they can kind of size each other up a bit. Very, very limited. There might be some kind of wrestling or some sort of kind of physical alteration, but usually it's just kind of this vocalization and things like that. In terms of salamanders, they do a similar thing. They'll have most of the time some behavioral kind of traits. They might bob their head. They might bite or snap at other salamanders. So they definitely have these kind of sets of like either vocalizations or behavioral things that they'll do to say, back off, this is my territory. Okay, let's move on. So what we're seeing though is that amphibians are declining, and they're declining at a rate that is really alarming to scientists. We call this a mass extinction event. In the past, there have been several mass extinction events. We characterize these as where most of the life on Earth, or much of the life on Earth, has gone extinct. Usually, this has happened in the past for reasons that are really predictable and reasons that take a long time to happen. So if we look at some of these in the late Ordovician, this is about 450 or so million years ago. And then Earth rebounded about 100 million years later. In the Devonian, we had another mass extinction event, another one in the Permian. And what we saw with these was that there were these really strong climatic changes. Sometimes that could be from volcanic eruptions. Other times it could be just really kind of strong shifts in how the climate's operating on Earth. And they were really causing a lot of harm. So these changes were happening at a rate that was really fast geologically. And what I mean by that is these changes may have taken 100 or 200,000 years to happen, but it was fast enough that species couldn't really keep up with those changes. So historically, we saw these mass extinction events happen because of these kind of climatic changes that were occurring, sea level rise, volcanic eruptions, big swings in temperature, but they were taking thousands of years to kind of materialize. But most of the life on Earth would go extinct and then it would rebound. What we saw during the dinosaur extinction, that's this late Cretaceous extinction, this was unique in that an asteroid hit the Earth. And the asteroid was so big and so powerful that it actually created so much dust that it blocked the sun. And that's the extinction the dinosaurs underwent. It was about 75 million years ago. It was the most recent one on Earth that we would say was a global mass extinction event. And remember, that happened when amphibians and reptiles were already on Earth. So they were living coinciding with dinosaurs. Dinosaurs and other animals went extinct. We saw our amphibians and reptiles stick around. And what we're seeing today is that amphibians are really characteristic of a couple other groups of species like fish that are undergoing a mass extinction event. And it's not to the point quite yet where we say every organism is going extinct, but we call this the Holocene extinction. It's a human-caused extinction event that is characterized by a loss of species that is so great that we call it a mass extinction, much like these other five that happen on Earth that we know about. So it's pretty alarming stuff to us, and it's something that we're really concerned about and studying heavily, and we need help from you all to help correct this. Quick question here before we move on. How do these amphibians affect the biodiversity of the area in which they reside in? That's a really good question. We'll touch upon that towards the end of the lecture, but what I would say is that it's a couple different ways. Most of the time, what we see is that amphibians are so abundant, there's so many of them around, that they provide this really good food source. So if amphibians are declining in particular areas, then we're losing this kind of base of a food web in a lot of things. Everything eats an amphibian basically, even other amphibians. So losing them could really undercut species that eat them, which can impact biodiversity. What we've also seen is that amphibians have pretty big effects on ecosystems. And when they're not there, they can alter how ecosystems operate, which could reduce biodiversity as well. So we'll talk more about it, but there's a couple ways that loss of amphibians can impact ecosystems. And when I say loss of amphibians, I really mean loss. What we currently estimate is about 1/3 of all known amphibian species are at risk of extinction. Remember, we're still finding a lot in the tropics. Every time we go to the tropics, we find more species that we never knew about. And we're still describing species today in the United States even. So they're really at risk. Most amphibians on Earth are at risk, and about 1/3 of them are really at risk of not existing on Earth anymore. When we talk about extinction, it's something that happens naturally, though. There's a background extinction rate. We know the rate at which animals go extinct naturally on Earth. It's usually a couple species a year. So a couple amphibian species a year would go extinct naturally, just from natural causes of predation, or their evolution really didn't prepare them for the environment that there is today, or changes or disease. What we're seeing today is that the rate of extinction of amphibians is thousands and thousands of times higher than what we would expect. Over the past 200 years, we believe that, or over the past 50 years, we believe that about 200 species of amphibians have gone extinct. And this number is most likely higher, again, because we're still describing species. There's species that went extinct that we didn't know existed even. So we expect another 7% of frog species alone will be lost in the next 100 years or so. So we're seeing a lot of really scary predictions that we hope don't come true, but we're really worried that they are. So amphibians are really declining at a rate that is not sustainable, and we're really concerned about that rate. Let's talk about the reasons they're declining. We can really characterize this into mostly human-driven causes of extinction. So the mass extinction event that amphibians and other taxa are undergoing on Earth today, we consider as human-driven. It's not asteroids hitting the Earth. It's not natural climate change that's occurring. It's human-driven, these effects. So what we'll do is kind of list them here. And you can also think of these as really broad scale causes of threats to species. So if you talk about mammals or fish or insects, these five or six categorizations of these threats to amphibians apply to these other species as well. Really in this order for the most part as well. So what I want to talk about first is habitat destruction, destroying the habitat that amphibians and other species live in. Amphibians are really prone to disease and pollutants as well. Global climate change is one that is a current threat to amphibians, but really what we're concerned about is more of a future threat of global climate change and what it could cause amphibians. Another one that is not limited to amphibians, but is really impacted them pretty significantly is the pet trade and overexploitation. So let's talk about these a little bit more detail. When we talk about habitat destruction, what we mean is a couple things. It could mean that we're literally destroying the habitat. It could mean that we're draining the wetlands to create farmland, that we're cutting down forest, that we're converting large tracts of land to urbanization where most amphibians just can't live. So there's that one part of what we call habitat destruction is just complete habitat loss. Another thing that's impacting amphibians is what we call habitat fragmentation. So if you look at the picture on the left here, we see this kind of mosaic of habitat. There's some forest back here. There's patches of forest and farmland mixed in. There might be some wetlands in there as well. Whereas historically, this may have been a completely forested area. Now, we didn't cut down all of the forest. It's not a complete habitat loss, but we have fragmented the forest parcels. There's some forest here, some here, a big chunk back here. So what that has done is kind of compartmentalize these amphibians. If you think about, living as a frog, you're pretty small, usually. Salamanders and frogs, toads, newts, they're really generally small animals. So if you're living in this area and the area starts getting impacted around you, it's not just harming the species that used to be here where the farmland exists, but the forests are gone, so they're not. But it's also restricting these in the forest that are in patches. They're kind of stuck there because if they try to leave, the next forest might be too far away that they can't get across that habitat. It might be too dry. They're at risk to predators, so they just can't get there. So it limits their dispersal. It's called dispersal limitation. When you fragment the habitat like this, you're not just losing habitat, but what's fragmented is of less quality. It might be too far away where you're separating these populations too far, and it's further stressing them in terms of their evolution, in terms of the resources that they have. So we're seeing that this combination of both habitat loss and fragmentation is a big thing that is leading to these declines of species. Okay, good question here. Have I ever eaten an amphibian? If so, which one tastes the best? I've only had one. I've only had frog legs, and they taste like chicken, but I have not eaten any others. There are reports of people eating salamanders in the Appalachian Mountains. There's lots and lots of salamander species there. That's really where I did most of my work, is studying lungless salamanders in the Appalachian Mountains the most diverse place in the world for them. And historically, people have eaten those. I don't know if I would, but so I can't tell you which one tastes the best, but frog legs are okay if they're sustainably caught and raised, which almost never happens. So let me talk about amphibian diseases now. There's a couple really alarming diseases that have happened in the past and that are currently happening that we're really concerned about. The one that you may have heard about is called the chytrid fungus. And this was made really famous for the most part by Dr. Karen Lips. When Dr. Lips was in the tropics, they started seeing these massive die-offs in frog populations. They would go to streams to study frogs, and there would be hundreds and hundreds of dead frogs around. And very quickly, Dr. Lips and other scientists realized that this was due to this fungus called the BD fungus or the chytrid fungus. And what it does is it affects these frog populations different ways. The larvae, the babies, the little tadpoles, it'll actually uh, create these kind of basically deformed mouth parts so they can't eat as well. And some of the adults would actually, it will just kind of plug up their skin so they can't breathe that well through their skin and or it's not as porous. So what Dr. Lipp saw was that the fungus started in this kind of Western Central America, and something was triggering it to be really virulent. You can find citrus fungus everywhere. You can go out to Illinois and find it. But it was something about the climatic changes that were occurring due to climate change that was making it really toxic. And through the years, every year, the fungus would start going farther east into the tropics. So Dr. Lips and other scientists were able to get ahead of that. They would start sampling over here before the fungus arrived. And there's teams of scientists that were going to try to collect animals that oftentimes they didn't know what they were because they were new species, and just collecting them before the fungus could come through and kill it. And they would study different aspects of the biology of these organisms and try to keep them there to try to reintroduce them later. So this chytrid fungus is something that is really concerning. It's causing die-offs in a lot of parts of the world right now, but we really notified the existence of it in Central America. There's another fungus that is occurring in a lot of parts of Europe and in other parts of I think Africa now even. It's called BSAL. It's this fungus that affects salamanders in particular, and it operates similarly to kind of the chytrid fungus, but it's really salamander-ish focused, and it's something that we're really concerned about with respect to like trading of salamanders or exporting of salamanders across the world. We're worried this fungus can basically be transmitted. Some other things like the ranavirus is causing a lot of amphibian issues. It's causing mass die-offs like these here in frog populations. And it's a really weird virus that can exist in one population and not have any harm, and then in another population kill everything. So we're still learning about all these, but these are the kind of three primary ones that we're really concerned about, and they're causing harm for a lot of amphibian species. We're also seeing that pollutants are having a big effect on amphibians. And this causes a lot of different issues. Sometimes a pollutant that enters the waterway or the environment, since these amphibians all have this porous skin for the most part. Castilians are pretty blocked off, but most amphibians have this porous skin, this permeable skin. A lot of times pollutants can outright cause death of organisms. But other times it does these what we call kind of direct effects that aren't death. They're not lethal. So they can cause deformities like this, these frogs growing extra legs or losing legs. And these animals might survive, but they'll survive for a lot less. They won't be as effective. And other times, what we see is that these pollutants in the waterways can actually alter sex ratios. So, if you think about this issue, what we're seeing a lot of is these amphibians are actually absorbing a lot of the pharmaceutical drugs that we take as humans. We consume them as humans. Our body kind of produces them, but doesn't break them down fully. And then we excrete them out. We urinate them out. So it gets into the water bodies through wastewater treatment plants and all these other mechanisms where water goes, septic tanks. They're not able to pull out these pollutants. So they enter the waterway, and then we're starting to see those pharmaceuticals and other pollutants impact amphibian populations through the water. And it's something that's causing a lot of harm to amphibians, but it should be a big alarm bell to humans because this is a vertebrate that's getting impacted by this. And if the concentrations are enough or certain things get into the environment, it could actually have a similar effect to humans that we're concerned about. What we're also seeing is that we're really concerned about climate change. And there's a couple different ways that we think climate change could impact species. And it could be that it just directly gets too warm so that species can't live in certain areas. And that's something that hasn't quite happened yet, but we're really concerned that it's going to happen in the future. And other times it could just change what we call the phenology of species. That just means they have this kind of synchronous cycle of life history. They go breed at a certain time, they go visit wetlands at a certain time, they might migrate at certain times. And most amphibians are doing that from cues to the environment, from temperature and precipitation cues. As those change as a function of climate change, what we're seeing right now is that amphibians are responding to that and they're changing their phenology. They're breeding earlier, they're breeding later, they're changing when they're doing things. So that could be considered good or bad depending on the situation, but we're seeing changes from climate change like that. And then we're predicting changes that are more scary. This is a former graduate student of mine made this really cool map here where he took all the amphibian species in the Midwest and he looked at where they lived and what the climate was like where they lived historically. And he was able to say, okay, based on the climate right now, we expect there to be this many species of amphibians in the climate in these areas. And then Brock was able to overlay changes in climate in the future. And he showed that if the climate changes as we expect, there'll be less species of amphibians that can live there. The climate won't be suitable for them. So what we're doing with climate change is twofold. We're kind of documenting what sort of changes are occurring now, and then we're also kind of predicting changes that might occur in the future based on how we expect the climate to change. So the fifth really primary reason why amphibians are declining is what we call pet trade and overexploitation. The pet trade is really quite simple. Folks are collecting animals from the wild, they're keeping them as pets, and or really mostly they're breeding them or taking them from the wild and then sending them off to trade in different areas. So they keep taking from the wild to supply either breeding colonies of them or just to trade them outright. So there's that really removal from the wild of these animals. And in addition to that, what we see is that amphibians are being overexploited. This is in particular I would say areas that are developing nations. They are collecting a lot of animals for food, and they're doing so in such a number that it's really not sustainable for the amount of people that are doing it and the amount of people that are on Earth. So when you couple this kind of pet trade and consumption of these animals for food, it really takes a lot of animals out of the wild. And then also when you're shipping animals across the country, if you're not doing that legally, then a lot of times it can actually transmit disease and cause harm to organisms that aren't even where the disease came from. So it's pretty alarming and something that we're really concerned about and that's really impacting amphibian populations. What does this all mean? So why do we care if amphibians are actually going extinct or they're declining? There's a couple primary reasons, one of which I kind of touched upon. They're food for a lot of animals. Amphibians are a great prey resource. There's a lot of them. They're not super fast usually. And even if they are fast, there's usually a lot of them around to pick off. They're full of protein and nutrients. So, what we know and what little we know really is that amphibians are a really big part of the food web in terms of just supplying food for other organisms. It's a huge part of what they do. So just being super abundant, it's it means that they're really a big food resource. We have another question here. If I had a chance to transform into any amphibian, which one would I choose? That's a good question. I think I would choose a lungless salamander and I would live somewhere in the Smoky Mountains. And it's not because that's what I study a lot, but these animals have a really cool life. They live in an environment that is really kind of cool and moist and beautiful, and they have a really slow lifestyle. When it rains, they'll surface and from the forest floor, and they'll eat a couple bugs. They'll go back down and hang out. They can live for 20 or 30 years doing that. So it's a pretty kind of cool slow-paced life cycle that I think would be neat. Okay, let's continue about what this means. What some of my research has shown and others is that amphibians can actually be really important for ecosystems. And what we say is that they're important for what we call an ecosystem function. What that means is that ecosystems are operating based on a bunch of different inputs, and certain things are happening in ecosystems that are helping the entire ecosystem function well. These are things then that we can measure. We can say if nutrients are cycling well, then that means that ecosystem is operating well. So what we know is that there's some evidence to suggest that amphibians are really important for these ecosystem functions. Some of the stuff that I study looks at the nutrient cycling of amphibians. So if we just think about this little salamander here, this is a little lungless salamander, and where they exist, like I mentioned, there's a lot of them. The biomass of these, because there's so many of them individually, even though they're small, the biomass of them outweighs deer, small mammals, birds. So there's just simply a lot of them. And if you look at this individually, you're like, well, big deal that there's one salamander that is cycling nutrients. But when you add up all the salamanders and all the biomass of salamanders, it really creates this big ecosystem function effect. In this particular case, we can think about the salamander eating bugs. The bugs would have maybe different level of phosphorus. That's a really limiting nutrient in wildlife is phosphorus. They need it for their bones. They need it for DNA. So you want phosphorus. These bugs will have different levels of phosphorus. So the salamander is going to eat these bugs. And it's going to take that phosphorus from those bugs. It's going to say, I need this much, I need this much, I need this much. And then it's going to utilize that. It's going to grow. It's going to reproduce with that phosphorus it's eating from the bugs. But there's a lot of times it doesn't need as much phosphorus as it's eating. So what would happen is the salamander is going to take this phosphorus that's organic. It's in a bug. It's going to eat it and it's going to excrete it. It's going to poop it out. When a salamander does this in other amphibians, it poops out this phosphorus in inorganic form. Plants can use inorganic phosphorus, they can't use organic. So that's what we call nutrient cycling. The salamander is taking this organic resource, it's gobbling it up, utilizing it, and it's converting it to something inorganic. That organic to inorganic conversion is what nutrient cycling is. And then once it gets into the plant again, it turns organic. Cycle continues. So these salamanders, even though there aren't big, there's simply so many of them that they can cycle nutrients in ecosystems among other processes and be really important. Another important thing about amphibians is that we get a lot of medical advancements from them. And this is really unique thing that amphibians alone can provide. Amphibians, a lot of them can actually regenerate limbs. So there's some salamander species in particular where you can cut off an entire arm or a leg and they will regrow it. Not just their tail, they'll regrow bone, everything. They'll literally regrow a limb. It might take a few months, but they'll do it. And if you think about that from a medical perspective, we would love to have that ability as humans. So to learn how these amphibians do it, we can perhaps apply those techniques to medicine and do it in that case. Poison dart frogs are a really classic example of a medical advancement coming from an amphibian. These poison dart frogs have certain toxins that they oftentimes get from converting the ants that they eat into their tissue, and they can accumulate and make these toxins. And the toxins have been used for years, millennia really, to cause harm. But what we're seeing now is that these toxins actually have a lot of medical advancements, in particular with cancer research. And when we think about something like this, it's really cool to highlight this, but we also have to highlight that a lot of these species that we're seeing these things come from are at risk. They're either at risk of extinction or are extinct themselves. And many, many species that we don't even know exist might have more medical advancements that we don't even know about yet because we haven't just found the species yet. So this is just a couple highlighted reasons why these amphibians are so important to try and conserve. Okay, we have a few minutes left, so I just wanted to spend a few minutes just answering any other questions that you all may have. And thank you for having me again. And please, no question is left unturned. Thank you again. Both the chat and the Q&A are open. If you have any other questions, I can hang back.
I'm not sure if you answered this one, but someone asked, do you have any favorite zoology documentaries?
That's a good question. I do have one. I think the Life in Cold Blood series is my favorite. And all those Life series by the BBC are great.
This.
I think there's yeah.
Oh, here
You
you
have
go.
another one.
Oh, good.
Yeah, you got it.
Okay, so what sparked my interest in amphibians? That's a great question. That was really a professor of mine when I was in college, is Dr. Craig Weatherby, was a herpetologist. And for all the reasons I just stated how cool they are, that's really what sparked my interest. It was an animal that you can find, that you can handle, which I just thought was really just intriguing to me, to study in animals that I can capture and actually keep in my hand and study and touch. Whereas if I was an ornithologist, if I studied birds, I just saw that as less hands-on, I guess. You know, you're doing a lot of binocular work, so it just didn't interest me as much. But once I realized how many there were and some of the cool things about them, it just uh it just really led to my interest flourishing a lot.
Well, thank you so much for coming. It was a really interesting presentation and we learned a bunch.
Thank you much.
Yep. And thank you for all the attendees that watched this webinar.
I know some are even from Elgin, so but thank you so much. It was really fun to learn about amphibians, salamanders. I think they're really cute. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, wait, I think there's another one in the
Oh.
Q&A.
Oh,
There
one more.
is
Yeah.
one
Oh, the most dangerous amphibian. So there's a set of poison dart frogs in the tropics that are you don't want to mess with. They're by far the most dangerous.
Okay. If there are no more questions, I think
That's it.
Yeah, that's it. We are it's 1 o'clock. If anyone has any more questions, if they want to quickly put it in, but I see people leaving, so